is artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and why diversity matters more than ever. Please welcome Miriam Hernandez-Kakol, Transformational Global Business and Thought Leader, HITEC Board Director, retired KPMG Partner, and Director of Hovnanian Enterprises. And Judith Spitz, Ph.D., Founder and Executive Director, Breakthrough Tech, because the future of innovation depends on all of us.
Hello, everyone. I'm joining you here with Judy. We're at Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island, and happy to say the sun just broke through. It's been very cloudy this morning. So I want to spend some minutes with you. Judy and I have known each other for quite some time. We'll get into that whole history, won't we, Judy? Yep. And we want to spend time with having Judy share with us her ideas and her research and the work that she's been doing around why diversity in tech really matters, and especially focusing on our whole digital transformation environment and artificial intelligence. So let's get right to it, Judy. Great. Happy to be here. I've always wanted to visit the Cornell Tech campus. I remember when I heard from Lowell McAdam that you were going to come from Verizon. He was then the CEO of Verizon, and you were the CIO, and that's how I knew you, that you were going to come and start a program for diversity and women in tech, and that Cornell Tech was going to be the core of it. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really cool. I know that you had always been such an advocate. And of course, I know that you knew exactly why diversity mattered in your career, meaning the difficulty of being the only woman in the room and how you grew that into an opportunity. So tell us a little bit about your journey to Cornell Tech campus that we're sitting at today.
Sure, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. As I think you'll all hear, Miriam and I have been friends and colleagues for a long time. Let's come back to that at some point because I think it's an important lesson. But it's my pleasure to be here. It's been an interesting journey. My career journey has been anything but the straight and narrow, which is an important message I give to a lot of young people, young women in particular, is the expression is it's a jungle gym, not a ladder. So I actually started my career in academia. Spent half a dozen years there teaching, actually at the City University of New York, and then took that jump over into applied research, working for a company called 9X, which you have to be old enough to even remember that name, but it's the predecessor company of Verizon. And sort of started my corporate career in what seemed like a reasonable extension of academia, doing applied research and development. Thought that was the 3 to 5 year plan before I went back to academia, and 30 years later, I was still there. So, that story, first of all, interestingly enough, I started in an artificial intelligence lab back in the dark ages of AI. Interesting because some of the problems we have now are the same ones then. And then spent the next several decades moving further on into from specialized technology, which was speech technology, into more general software development and up the management chain, and then eventually to be the chief information officer for one of Verizon's 3 business units, which was the last 10 years. So it was an interesting career, certainly a wonderful career. And as you said, was always invested in bringing along other young women, women leaders, and just in general, being a student of leadership to help raise up the generations behind me. And as I started to think about what I was going to do after my Verizon career, I just honestly was scratching my head about how extraordinary it was to me that I was almost always the only woman in the room, and that it had been that way for so long. I started to actually, we can talk more about statistics, but I started to look into the data and realize that actually the challenge for women in tech had been getting worse over the decades of my career, and so decided to invest my second career, my passion project, if you will, to see if we could actually do something significant in that space and do it in a different way than others were approaching it. So I'll take just a minute to talk about what that approach is, and then we can go
yes,
from
absolutely.
there. What I understood from doing the research was that most of the attention around diversity in tech in general and women in tech in particular was being done at the K through 12 level. And I'm all in favor of that. I think the K through 12 initiatives are incredibly important. But it occurred to me that there was this huge opportunity space at the undergraduate level. 58% of the undergraduate community are women, and only 1% of them are studying computer science. So I decided that that's where we needed more attention. So we're focused on undergraduate women. Breakthrough Tech is a program that picks large, diverse public universities and partners with them in order to deliver innovative programs. The other aspect of what we do is, won't be surprising based on my career, we stand at the intersection of industry and academia. And that's really important because these two giant institutions, although their intentions are right, are mostly pointing fingers at each other. Industry saying, yeah, we'd love to hire more diverse people in tech and more women, if only academia would be producing more of them. And academia is saying, hey, you know what, if you keep recruiting from the same places with the same criteria, the people you hire are going to continue looking the same. And so Breakthrough Tech is really about partnering with public universities, standing at that intersection, and developing programs that can lead to systemic change.
So a couple of examples. A new one in Miami is very exciting.
Yes. So we started in New York.
Yes.
Partnering with CUNY. And we were able to deliver programs that had an impact. And so fortunately, we were able to get funded by some of the very companies I saw introduced here, KPMG among them, to replicate what we were doing. So we next went to Chicago, University of Illinois at Chicago, whose demographics are quite similar to CUNY's, not scale, but then we went to Washington, D.C., in partnership with George Mason University and University of Maryland College Park. And just a few months ago, we announced our partnership with Florida International University in Miami, which I believe is not only is an HSI, but I believe is the largest computer science department in terms of Hispanic participants in the country.
Correct. I looked that up after you told me, and you are right.
Yes. Miami is an incredibly growing tech scene. I was actually just there a few days ago. Mm-hmm. And there's an extraordinary amount going on there. The whole city, the public sector, the private sector, and the universities are all leaning in to this diversity in tech effort. So it's a very exciting place to be.
Well, I remember learning all about what started the beginnings of Breakthrough Tech when it was Whitney, and focused in New York with CUNY. And I think you're underplaying a little bit what an impact you had in recruiting multiple corporations to fund this. Initially, it was a very select club, and then you started to grow that. I know that the people themselves, the CEOs from those corporations, were quite committed, so they helped. I know, for instance, in the case of KPMG, Lowell really reached out to our CEO, Lynn Dowdy, yep. And I was whispering in her ear, and so yep. We're still funders and are big participants in the intern program, the Wintern program, which I hope to talk about a little bit later. And I think that it's really remarkable because you look at different programs, as you say, K through 12, and you look at junior achievement, NAP, many organizations that are focused there. And then you look at colleges and you don't see as much. Mm-hmm. And I know for HITEC, we give scholarships. We do a lot of work with Cristo Rey high schools in order to sponsor some of our Hispanic students into college. So to me, part of what's missing, and we can talk about this later, is that overlap and how do we connect these programs so that we're not all isolated and we're all trying to do for good to really accelerate this growth of diversity and diverse people inside of our tech industries and our tech roles. But how do we better connect those? To me, that's just like become a little bit of a important rally cry in my retirement, because I've taken a page from Judy's book. I told her this, she is like my hero about what you do in your second career, because she's having such an impact. She's now gotten big funders to come her way. I'll let you talk about that. Come her way because of the programs and the outputs that are happening. I've met many of these young women through another organization that Judy and I participate in together. They're amazing young women, many of them women of color, who are now really sticking to, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a computer scientist. They're not being, it's not becoming a detriment to be in the classroom and not see as many of people like you, right? So anyway, I just want to sing your praises because you've inspired me, and I've now started, okay, how do I help like bridge all these gaps between these programs, because I'm involved in so many.
So we said a number of really important things. The connection between the programs that happen in middle school and high school and what happens in college are really important. I used to say, we do all these great things in middle school and high school, and then we cross our fingers and hope that it sticks.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll stick for the students who probably would have gone that way anyway. But what I think people don't understand are the barriers to entry that exist at the undergraduate level. Everything from getting into a computer science class, if you haven't already declared a major, to being able to get your foot in the door of an internship and so on. All the data shows that students of color and women in tech are underrepresented in internships beyond their underrepresentation in general.
Yes.
And we all know that getting that paid summer internship is the key to getting a job when you graduate. So we have to pay attention to sort of a continuity of programming. Otherwise, we know that the students who are vulnerable are gonna fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
By the way, the other thing is the folklore that if you don't get to students while they're in middle school, all is lost. I don't believe at all. I agree. It's baloney. Should you get to them, then great. But all the data shows that if you get underrepresented students and women in particular into an introduction to computer science class at the college level, and you teach it in a way that actually welcomes them as opposed to being unwelcoming, the numbers will increase. The other thing that you talked about is our relationship and the relationships that got us our first round of funders. And it's one of my top 5 sort of talking points when I talk to young people coming up is relationships matter. They really matter.
They do.
It was my relationship with Lowell that got Verizon in as our first funder, his relationships with other CEOs that got me in that door, our relationship that started as a business relationship because KPMG was working with my organization, that led me to be able to come to you and say, hey, I'm doing this new thing. And you saying, tell me where to sign, us joining that women's networking group, and so on. And I just I think people should be encouraged to leverage their relationships. There's nothing wrong with it. That's the way you can move mountains, is through the relationships that you have.
And I always love to say, though, sometimes women, we are a little hesitant to do that. Men have been doing it for a long time, and it works quite well.
Right.
And this is why you're speaking at HITEC today, because I leveraged my relationship with you, because I wanted the HITEC audience to hear what we're going to talk about. One more thing. we found out our paths have crossed way before we actually knew it when you were in that applied research lab and I was working at Belcor working on speech recognition to automate, and now I'm really dating myself, to automate directory assistance. You were on the 9X side of things and we had a common client. And we found that out one night when we were having a glass of wine talking, and we were like, really? Since we found out, we have common people who have worked for both of us, and we didn't even realize it. So It's a small world, but you have to leverage those relationships. They come in handy, and they lead to friendship, which I'm very happy and proud to call you my friend. So one of the questions we had was, can you repeat the percentage rate of undergraduate women in tech? So let's use that as getting into a little bit on the statistics.
Yeah, great. There are I've got a lot of numbers, and so just hang in there with me. One of the most important numbers is the percentage of women in the graduating classes of computer science. So all the students graduating in computer science, what percentage of them are women? Mm-hmm. The number today is between 18 and 19%. All the students getting bachelor's degrees in computer science, 18 to 19% of them are women. Here are a couple of important surround sound numbers. Back in 1985, actually when I started my career, so I'm dating myself, that number was 37%. 37% back in 1985 dropped to 18%. Now, we're not talking about STEM in general. You'll never hear me say that I'm working on women in STEM. Not that that isn't a great cause. I'm talking about the T in STEM. Mm-hmm. Because that is the one part of the STEM disciplines in which you're seeing the phenomenon I'm describing. Number of women in the sciences, natural sciences, life sciences, biology, chemistry, even math, has been going up.
Yeah.
Only in the T, and consider in that 30 years what's happened in the technology industry.
Yes.
Here's another important point. It went from 37% down to 18%. It hit that number in 2006, and it's been essentially flat ever since. Not so many people draw attention to that, because think about it, in the last 10 to 15 years, how much we've been talking about women in technology and women in computer science. So I look at that and say, whatever we're doing isn't working. We have to try some different approaches. So that's number one. Number two is a number of the opportunity space about undergraduate women. 58% of the undergraduate population are women. More than half of the undergraduate population are women, and only 1% of them are studying computer science. That's a different metric than what percent of the computer science, okay? But to me, that's the opportunity space. You only need to get up to 4 or 5% of the undergraduate women studying computer science. And you would increase the number of tech workers in this country by 57%. So the opportunity is huge. I just think it's important that we have to focus on the fact that we're talking about women in computer science, not women in STEM writ large.
I think that's a really good point, because the same thing is true among Hispanic numbers. Although we haven't had any real numbers since for a couple of years on the Hispanic front. 5.1% of computer science degrees go to Hispanics. That's men and women. So that's 5.1%. It's minimus, right? And it was
1% of them are women.
And only 1%, that was my next point, are women, Hispanic women. So it's really an incredible opportunity, as you said, for all of us. And the numbers, I don't have the exact number for Black Americans and African American women, but it's also very low. It's like a notch or two above Hispanic, but not much.
It's about 3%. And the other thing that's really should be a warning sign is in the last 5 or 6 years, those numbers have gone down.
Yes. And if you look at any of the numbers, total degrees, internships, they don't go up. They're flat. If they don't go down, they're flat. So there is a tremendous opportunity for us here. All of this really to set the scene for what we want to talk about, which is, why is diversity today in this digital age, when all you hear about is digital transformation, and with bringing AI out of the, dark ages, into the dark ages, there I go talking with my hands again. It's live, folks, so we have excitement here. I dripped my water onto Judy's laptop, but we're going to continue talking as we can. I'll try. My husband says, don't put my hands anywhere near water when I'm talking. Why is diversity so important? Not that it hasn't always been important, but right now with AI really growing at the pace that it is, the amount of technology, the apps, the platforms, all of the focus and investment by companies in digital transformation and AI, why is diversity more important than ever? And what value can we drive out of it?
So let's start with the first question.
And I'll get while you talk, I'll get the rest of the Kleenex here for the rest of the water. Hey, we're spontaneous if nothing else.
So there are a lot of reasons why diversity matters in AI, even more so. The simplest one is that it's the fastest growing sector in tech. So it's where the job opportunities are, it's where the money is, it's where the opportunity is, it's where the industry needs are. Industry will tell you that there is a shortage of AI talent, not to promote something that I recently done, but I just published an article in Forbes.com.
Yes, I was going to mention it. Yes,
about the AI, the supposed scarcity of AI talent. So you can look it up to see that what I said there. But
by the way, she has a series of articles in Forbes. Like every 2 months or so, you have an article.
Trying for every
other month. So if you want to look her up in Forbes, I always read her articles. They're very thought-provoking. So make sure and do that.
Thank you. Forbes.com. There is a opportunity, economic, employment, a workforce need, and so on. But I'd say almost a more compelling need is the impact that AI technologies are having on our society. There's a lot of force for good, and there's a lot of opportunity to be concerned about. And you've probably heard the term algorithmic bias.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just a little bit of background. To some extent, algorithmic bias has always been around. It predates the digital world. The example I like to give is in the design and development of the airbags that we have in our cars. People may or may not know that at the very beginning, airbags actually caused a lot of bodily harm and injury to women and children.
Yes.
Why is that? It's because they were designed in the automotive laboratories where the models of the passengers sitting in the car were all based on the size and structure of men. And so where the airbag interacts with your head and neck is different. And that's a form of design bias. It's just was built into the way the technology was designed because they didn't have a diverse set of models. Same thing is true in speech technology. In the earliest days of speech technology, speech recognizers, the things you now all know as Siri and Alexa, did a terrible job of recognizing voice produced by women. Why? Because all of the people in the labs at AT&T and IBM and MIT were men. And they were creating the recordings that were training these computer systems. And they got overtrained to what the male voice sounded like. The challenge now is that there is very much still algorithmic bias, gender, racial, and socioeconomic, racial bias. People have probably read that there have been some very notable cases of misrecognition of faces amongst Black Americans. Why? Because there aren't enough people of color and Black faces in the training data. These can lead to really terrible outcomes, and have, in terms of people being arrested inappropriately. And there are other examples. Gender. People may not be aware, but when a female software developer resume is reviewed by one of these automated resume reviewing systems, they are less likely to rise to the top of the pool of potential candidates. Why? Because the system has overlearned that male names are more associated with software development positions. That's in the data. It's an ill intent of an algorithm. It's in the training data. And socioeconomic bias. People who apply for a loan are judged in part by an algorithm that uses their zip code, and therefore has certain socioeconomic risk factors that are not necessarily appropriate. So these things exist, and the danger now is, because of the explosion of AI technologies in all aspects of our lives, these algorithms and the bias that they bring along are ubiquitous. They're global. They're not in just pockets of society anymore, and they're opaque. Meaning, if you go to the developers and say, which variables is your algorithm using in order to make a decision, for the most part, developers can't even tell you anymore, because it's all done on these huge databases and so on. You have to really go an extra mile to try to decipher what are the variables that are impacting these algorithms. So this has a pervasive impact. It has the potential to have a serious impact on all aspects of how we live and work, because that's what AI is impacting. And one of the most important ways, there are many ways, but in terms of diversity, one of the most important ways to try to counteract this, I call it the first line of defense, is to make sure that you actually have a diverse team of people who are designing the algorithms, who are at the design tables, who are looking at the outcomes, and who are asking the hard questions.
And in that case of having the right people at the table, it's not just design. Isn't it also implementation? Isn't it also having ongoing governance over what's happening, not only in the design, but also in how you're implementing the technology?
Yeah. So if you, there's some interesting data in terms of whether companies will report that they're actually getting the kind of value out of this transformative technology as expected. And this often happens. There are hype curves, and everyone's familiar with that.
I think I read that McKinsey says less than 25%, right?
Right. So I think there are some things about how to implement AI technology that actually have parallels. So let's go back to, we'll all remember the explosion of cloud-based systems. Well, we all lived through that. And there was sort of an initial approach, which was called lift and shift, right? Yes. I was a CIO at the time. We looked at all of our
sold a lot of those services, yes.
all of our legacy systems, and said, let's just pick them up and move them over and plop them down in the cloud. And then we'll be cloud enabled, and we'll get all of the extraordinary efficiencies associated with the cloud. No, that's not
so
the way
much.
It works. We expected to get all of the resiliency of the cloud just because we moved the systems over. We expected to get the efficiencies of DevOps, of cloud-based development. No, not if it's a legacy system and so on. And until we started to do what was called building cloud-native systems, systems that from the ground up were designed to operate in the cloud, were designed for that kind of continuous design and development, were designed for the kind of resiliency that the cloud can allow. Then we got the benefits. Same thing in mobile app development. What is the first thing we all did in mobile app development? We took our websites
and put them on
the phone.
Yes.
And people thought, this is terrible. The user experience was terrible.
Terrible.
We were not taking advantage of the fact, just for example, that the phone knew where we were. we weren't taking advantage of the things that came inherently as part of
the
being
phone.
on a mobile device. And then we had what we call mobile first development, designed specifically
For a
that.
mobile device,
So
yes.
I think that's where we are in terms of AI. What people are doing right now is taking technology, AI technology, and literally bolting it onto the side of whatever their existing business processes are, and then expecting transformational results. And I think instead what we need to be doing is building AI native business processes that are built from the ground up, figuring out how this technology is going to interact with and change our regular business processes. The other aspect of that is this concept, and we all have heard it, that the purpose of AI is to replace humans. And, it's the big concern, and a lot of people are worried about it and so on. I actually think that's ill-founded to begin with.
Right.
That all of technology has always proven in the main to basically enhance what humans are capable of. And that, again, requires specific design. My best example is the one we started with. You and I called it directory assistants.
Yes.
Nobody knows that name anymore. They're just called contact centers.
Yes.
And the way that technology, from the very beginning of AI to today, speech, technology, chatbots, and so on, have been designed, is to say, how can we put the technology on the outside of the call center and prevent the call from getting to an agent? We all know how much customers hate that.
Yes.
Right? We also know that leads to a very small percentage of the transactions being actually automated, and then customer gets thrown over the wall to an agent to start all over.
In fact, in some cases, the wait times, the talk times, all of the metrics that are costly increase.
Right. A different way to think about that is to put the technology inside the call center, alongside the agent, and design, but it has to be designed, a process and a technology where the agent and the technology are collaborating in a way that actually serves the customer. This is a very different way of thinking about it. You need people who are thinking about the challenge differently. I think those are the kinds of things that'll get us to the point where companies start actually seeing transformative value out of the technology.
And I really think that design table that you're talking about, that diversity of thought that needs to sit at that table, also needs to include the business partners. The business partners who are looking for the tangible, financial, customer satisfaction, et cetera, outcomes need to sit at the table, and that needs to be a diverse audience.
Absolutely. There are some really basic questions that the business leaders have to ask about deployment of technology.
Yes.
For example, what is the cost to your business of a false negative or a false positive? That is a very important business question. And the algorithm designers need to know that when they're designing the algorithm. They may not at all be equal. The cost of a false positive or a false negative could be very different to the reputation of your business and to the impact on your customers. The second thing, which is related, is what are you optimizing for? This is a critical question. We're working with a bunch of students now and helping them learn machine learning techniques. And one of the most important questions that they have to ask themselves is, what is the algorithm optimizing for? In order to know what kind of training data you need and how do you tweak the algorithm and so on. Those are business questions. Those are not technology questions.
Yeah. I want to just focus a little bit. We got a couple of questions. Can you see them, Judy?
Yeah. Okay.
Pick one.
All right, there are a couple here. One says, how do we grow the representation in tech? How can we accelerate the pipeline and move blockers preventing expedited growth? So a couple of things that we believe from having done this work for half a dozen years or so. One barrier is in the front door in undergraduate schools, and that is getting those students who didn't identify themselves as tech nerds since they were 9 into that first introductory computer science class. Now, how do you do that? Okay, the first thing is that you teach it in a way that actually emphasizes the fact that learning how to write code is, in most cases, not the end in itself. It's just a tool.
Yes.
It's a tool that you use to solve the problem you're really interested in solving, like world hunger or clean water or any number of things. So you have to teach that introductory to computer science class that way, which encourages sort of everyone to be interested in it as opposed to only narrow few. In order to do that, there's a lot of work at the undergraduate level, as I'm sure most people understand, curriculum innovation, class capacity, and so on. I happen to believe that an introduction to computer science should be a core gen ed requirement for every student getting a bachelor's degree because it's basic literacy.
Yes.
You may never write a line of code in your life, but having some clue how code gets written is important for all the people that you'll be working with. So there's a lot of that work that has to happen, systemic change at the undergraduate level to swing open the doors to a lot more people to walk in. The other is the barrier that happens for these underserved, underrepresented students to get their foot in the door of industry.
Yes.
And we have we've got lots of examples of industry saying that they want to lean in, that they want to hire more underrepresented students, more women, more Hispanics, and so on. And yet, if you actually look at the data, they are not getting through the front door.
Because they're still recruiting at the same colleges, as you said earlier, the same universities, and expecting a different result. They're not looking at interns starting in high school, which I firmly believe in. And they're not looking at a diverse way of doing internships. Maybe you started one in the winter, during the winter break. How do you get like a 3-week internship then, or winternship?
Right.
Anyway, I'll let you talk.
Yeah, so there's again, I'll plug somebody else's article. There's a wonderful article written in Techcrunch in December by two of my colleagues, Ruth Farmer and Tawana Franklin Davis.
Good article.
And the title of it is Industry Needs to Stop Conflating Privilege with Potential. Beautiful sentence. I wish I had written that sentence because our Internship program is designed specifically for that. Industry keeps looking for certain things on the resume. First of all, a pedigree institution, so recruiting from the same places, but also the kinds of activities like weekend hackathons and unpaid apprenticeships and all kinds of things that you need an awful lot of privilege to get on your resume, and assume that if you don't have those things because you're working 2 and 3 part-time jobs in order to support yourself and your family, you can't afford to go to weekend hackathons, that if you don't have those things on your resume, that somehow or another you don't have potential. And of course, we all know that isn't true.
Yep.
So one of Breakthrough Tech's flagship program is now called a Sprinternship program. Think sprint, like a software sprint. And the concept here is it is a 3-week paid micro internship that's done during a student's academic recess, not in the summer. That's key, because in the summer you're competing with companies' industry's summer internship program. Yeah. So in many cities we do it in January. If the students have 3 weeks off contiguously. In other places we do it in May. It is a paid internship by companies. KPMG does it for us. And we put these, in our case, young women, into those opportunities in their freshman and sophomore years. The whole point is to give them something on their resume, what I like to call resume juice, so that when they then apply for a summer internship, they get their foot in the door. We put them in a little cohort of 5 because they're early in their college years. It's actually easier for companies to manage 5 as a group than one-offs. And the results have been extraordinary. We've had over 1,300 women in our different cities experience the Sprinternship program, and their success rate in landing a summer internship with this on their resume versus not is 10-fold increase. That's just one example, again, standing at the intersection of industry and asking industry to do something different than it normally would, believe me, I hear from companies, well, we don't run internships in January. We say, yes, we know that.
We had to overcome some of that,
exactly.
I remember.
So those are the kinds of examples, and there are other things that we're doing to try to see where are the barriers, and programmatically, who can we bring to the table to impact that.
While you're looking for another question, the reason I mentioned Winternships, that was the former name. So you can see how long I've been with Judy going through this journey.
That's right.
But I love the change to Sprinterships. Is there another question?
Yeah, well, we had to do that because when we went to certain cities, if they didn't have 3 contiguous weeks in January, we called it a Winternship because it was in the winter. So we had to make it season agnostic.
Oh,
I actually like the sprint part of it because that's a real IT term. Okay, let's see here. So there's an AI talent shortage. Some of it has to do with the high requirements for the role. Many people are curious to go into this field, and yet few are given shots. How do you see this being tackled? So there are quite a number of programs that are trying to tackle this issue right now. Some of them are trying to introduce these concepts at the undergraduate level to get more students interested. The challenge there is how many different universities have AI programs that then can catch those students. There are examples of companies that are actually starting their own AI training programs outside of the university, attracting students who want to get trained in AI, and basically going around higher ed. I will say that there's a place for all of these solutions, and so it's great that we're seeing that kind of investment. I think it's all of the above, because the other challenge is the large number of undergraduate institutions that have students and high percentages of first-gen students of color, women of color, and so on, that don't have the AI academic muscle to train those students. And Breakthrough Tech in New York started a pilot program last summer, offered here at Cornell Tech, an Ivy League school, but not for Cornell Tech students, for the students in the surrounding New York ecosystem. If we have any of them on this call, I will tell you that we are recruiting applications now as we speak. You can go on Cornell Tech's website and search for it. And the concept here is to open the doors of the institutions that do have the kind of academic muscle to a much larger percentage of students.
And you're going to launch that program more broadly, I believe.
We are.
To be talked about later. Yes. So before we have a couple more questions, before we go back to that, I do want to talk a little bit about Optimism. You've mentioned a lot of programs. I still believe, like in your last explanation about these organizations that are retraining and training, kind of going around higher ed, then there's higher ed efforts, et cetera. I still believe we need to quarterback those towards an end where I kind of like the overlaps as opposed to not liking them, because I think in those overlaps, you can catch the people who are falling out into the gaps, as you talked about. But so I think that is an area that brings a lot of optimism to me, is that there's opportunity to weave those together and catch a bigger audience, if you will. But what other things make you optimistic that we're going to start moving the needle on the numbers?
So I think that the fact that there are so many third-party efforts that are trying to innovate, it does create a challenge in that you've got, sort of lots of seeds growing at the same time. But it allows for piloting things and seeing what really has an impact, and then figuring out how do you go from a pilot program to scale. That's the challenge. It's one coming from a corporate career where everything is at scale that we have always held Breakthrough Tech's feet to the fire, which is, don't do a pilot unless you can figure out if you're successful, how you're going to scale that. So I do see a lot of efforts. I see industry leaning in. I see a lot of third-party efforts. I think one of the opportunities is for the innovations that happen at the more top-ranked schools who have a lot of money to invest to figure out how do you replicate those things in a much broader set of undergraduate communities. But I think what we're trying to get at is how to drive systemic change that's lasting. The other thing that I think is interesting is that the pandemic, as we know, has created a world in which there's much more acceptance of online virtual experiences. Mm-hmm. Who would have thought that companies would be having virtual internships 3 or 4 years ago? Would have been pretty much unheard of.
Yes.
Not only did we do
untrusted.
Exactly. Same thing, of course, with higher ed but in our space, it's not only something we lived with, but what we're seeing is a lot of companies that are saying, well, actually, we're going to continue with some percentage of our internships being hybrid. Why? Because if you come to our office, guess what? There aren't that many people in the office. What that does is opens up, from geographic perspective, students who are from a far greater number of towns and cities that are not tech hubs and that don't have necessarily the wherewithal to move somewhere for an internship. And for industry to be able to recruit from all of those places. We're seeing it in our Sprinternship program, where we have companies that don't have a presence in some of our cities, but want to host our Sprinterns, and so do it online, do it in a virtual way. So it's really interesting how this is opening up, I think, opportunity at the undergraduate level to get connected to industry, which may be very distant. Now, there is a worry here. There's always a worry, in particular for women, because all the data shows that women in the workforce had a much more difficult time managing their careers. Somewhat counterintuitive when we were in a fully virtual mode, because they were also managing the household
and the children
and the children and so forth. So we just have to be careful when we have this panacea around what it's like for women in the workforce and a hybrid environment, that we make all the other necessary changes that are needed in order to support that kind of lifestyle.
You need a diverse design for this to work, and we have to design how the experience is going to work. I think we have a couple of minutes left, so we'll do one more question and then our sign off. I think that there is a question about, you got it? You're probably wondering in the audience why Judy, who's our guest, is doing all the reading instead of Miriam, but that's because this side of the table was wet and we had to move the laptop where we could see the question. So
that's okay. So there's a question about product development, I think. When we talk about the IT industry, we constantly make the mistake of creating amazing products, yet we constantly forget about the diverse, who are we building those products for, a diverse audience, non-accessible, non-binary, among others. What would be your recommendation to close the gap? I hate to be too simplistic about it, but it does matter who are the product managers and the product designers, in addition to who's building the technology. There's a reason why one of the first and earliest sort of tech unicorns that we all know of, is a car ride service for guys who are leaving a bar at 2 a.m. and can't find a cab.
Yes.
Right? Was that the most pressing need of all the possible uses for the shared economy, which Uber was one of the, by the way, we all love, all use Uber.
I will be using Uber later.
But of all of the potential needs of the share economy, which Uber is a prime example of, was a car ride service for taxis in metropolitan areas the most important?
Right.
Not necessarily. And there are a litany of examples like that. So it's incredibly important that as we think about all of the potential good and innovation that technology can bring, whether it's to healthcare or it's to climate control or it's to a refugee crisis, that you have people who have that as their primary goal,
yes,
as the product designers and developers and funders and so forth. Because again, the technology is just a tool. The question is, which problems are you focused on solving? And in order to get a diverse set of problems you're focused on, you need a diverse set of people at that table.
And I would venture to say that, back to your point and to this one about the problems and what you are really solving for, our young people, especially young women, I believe that our young people in general are really looking for things that can move the needle on saving the planet, on having more equity. And so I think these are the things to think about as you're forming design teams. So how do you motivate these young people, people of color, women, to really become involved in our tech industry and tech education? And because if they see the bigger good, I think it will be a driver for them.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate that we were able to do this. Apologies for the water, but we just kept on talking anyway. Thank you very much. I think we're about out of time. Have a great rest of the summit. I'm looking forward to many others of the presentations, et cetera, that we have planned.
Thanks for including me.
Yeah, it was great.